Good evening, everyone. Thank you, the Center for Adivasi Studies, Odisha, for inviting me to deliver the plenary address in the International Conference on Reclaiming Roots, the Adivasi Question. I am grateful to the director, Dr. Vikram Kesari Jena, and everyone from the institution for having given me this opportunity to share my research on tribal literatures. Today my topic is Tribes of Odisha, Identity, Culture and Law. A much neglected but significant part of our literary traditions, our tribal literatures, captures the complex socio-cultural and spiritual fabric of many native communities. Home of 62 tribes, Odisha has a corpus of tribal literature comprising oral traditions such as folk songs, myths, and legends, followed by contemporary written works. Through appropriate literary theories, my research critically investigates the artistic, cultural, and philosophical underpinnings of narratives produced by tribal communities in Odisha. The leitmotif being the Kond tribe from the Kondhamal district. While my focus is on some key texts and Jagannath culture, Jagannath cult, this study subsequently attempts to unveil the meanings and the worldviews prevalent in these stories and also tackles the alarming situation of protecting this vibrant oral tradition in the light of modernization and that has brought about cultural homogenization. By doing so, my research emphasizes the need to revise the place of tribal literature in the more significant and broader canon, and it takes its rightful position in the engagement of Indian and world literatures. Odisha's tribal population constitutes nearly 22% of the total state population, which is a very big number, isn't it? And it preserves a rich heritage baseline of indigenous culture, languages, and traditions. Out of its innumerable tribes, the second most undoubtedly enriched oral literary tradition is found in the population of the Kondh, Santhal, Bonda, Soura, Juang, and then Garba tribes. They maintain their communal memory through various literary genres like folk tales, epics, songs, proverbs, riddles, and ritual chants. These are not just art. These works embody like a kind of system of tribal knowledge systems and then the cosmologies that produce the entire philosophies, all of which subvert the Western ideas on literature. I am specially privileged to have designed one of the country's first ever MA programs in folklore and culture studies with near about 20,000 pages in print, out of which a couple of courses are titled as Tribes of India, Identity, Culture and Law. That is where I have talked about multiple tribal communities in the country from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and also Andamanese tribes, and that is where a couple of chapters talk about the Kond tribes and their Kui language. There is a volume, there is one course on the language death, and then we have taken Kui language as one of the case studies. A particularly remarkable example in my research is the Kui language of the Kond tribes cited from the Kondhamal district of Odisha. This Dravidian language is also an essential vessel for the oral literature of their culture. The Kond oral epics and ritual songs have incredible references to nature that initiate my research with the critical questions related to eco-criticism, green cultural studies, blue humanities, demonstrating the spirit of environmental protection and the ability of communities to elevate themselves. Similar stories are often found with the larger Odia cultural environment like the tribal links to the Jagannath cult, with the iconography of the idols, the three idols, and the traditions. Lakshmi Purana, for example, is a documentation of an exciting interface of the tribal and the mainstream religious practices. I have put mainstream under single quotes, and you understand what it means, isn't it? It shows goddess Lakshmi attracting the members of the forest dwelling tribes and the subaltern, the Dalits, into the ambit of her worshipping population. Now I can talk to you about the significance of tribal literature as a part of the world literatures. Tribal literature is much more than a form of art. It is a part of the cultural heritage and the social cohesion mechanism, and it reflects the community's worldview. However, these oral traditions have long been excluded from the mainstream literary criticism, often dismissing them as too primitive or unsophisticated to be taken seriously. Here I remember one incident when I was talking to late Padma Shri Manoj Das sir, and then it was an interview between me and Manoj Das sir. If you go to the internet and you type Nandini Sahu in conversation with Padma Shri late Professor Manoj Das, then I question him, sir, what do we understand by tribal literature? Then his basic idea was, he told me, Nandini ji, let's explain the points of distinction, the differences between tribal literature, folk literature, classical literature, and modern literature. Many people do not talk about these things. They use tribal literature and folk literature interchangeably. Now, there is also no such clear-cut distinction. If you go to internet and try to find out what is the difference between tribal literature and folk literature, it will give you some vague answers like folklore is unwritten tribal history. If you ask me, I would say folklore is a way of life, and tribal literature, it is very systematized. It's about, say, the Kondh tribal communities, their cultural heritages, their tangible and intangible cultural history. Or if you go to Gopinath Mohanty's novel like Poroja, he talks about the Poroja tribe and then their cultural heritages. So tribal literature to me is more systematized than folk literature, even if both of them date back to oral history. There is a very rigid school of thought which says that anything documented loses its folkloristics, loses its folklore elements, so it's no more folk literature. But I don't belong to that school of thought. I belong to a much more flexible school of thought vis-a-vis folklore, where I believe that all the rich cultural practices of our folks found in our novels, in our literature, in our folk tales, in folk poetry, and folk theatre, and our written and oral literatures, everything should be preserved in the written form now and presented to our classrooms, should be brought to the university tables in a pedagogical manner. So creating that research methodology for folklore, creating that that pedagogy for folklore has been a big challenge for me when I designed this MA in folk literature. As I told you, that in the year 2008, when the country was not talking about Indian knowledge systems or indigenous knowledge systems or Hindu studies or folklore for that matter, I was the one at that point of time. I had the audacity to get into these kinds of researches. So that is how in the year 2008 I launched the first PG diploma in folklore and culture studies in the country, with thousands and thousands of pages of print material, and then lots and lots of lectures in Gyan Darshan and Gyan Bani, in Swayam and Swayam Prabha channels most recently. And in 2021, I converted that PG diploma program to an MA in folklore and culture studies, and the program has been accepted by the students overwhelmingly. Well, now coming back to the significance of tribal literature in our mainstream canonization, let me tell you that my research uses modern literary theories to underline the intrinsic value of Odisha's tribal literature in its re-examination and rethinking. I'm using the term rethinking, because people have been thinking about folklore and tribal literatures in a very simplistic manner. Now let us rethink. It challenges the binaries of hierarchy between writing and orality, arguing in favor of the inclusion of tribal stories into contemporary Indian literary discourse. It also features the fluid interaction of tribal and mainstream cultures, perhaps best illustrated by the tribal character of the Jagannath cult. As such, my study not only brings a part of the tribal works into the canon of literature proper, but also it reminds the contemporary scholars of their inevitable extinction in an age defined by modernization. Keeping these hypotheses and these objectives in my mind, my research questions more or less deal with the thematic and technical exploration of a few pertinent tribal literary texts. I can pinpoint those as, let me just make them like 1, 2, 3, 4, right? For clarity. Number one is tribal literary study. It can approach the study of tribal literatures in Odisha from literary, cultural, and philosophical perspectives. That is number one. Number two is revisiting the oral traditions. The preservation of oral narratives, examining the function of the Kui language. Kui is the language of the Kondh tribal groups from the Kandhamal districts. And then next is interconnections of religious practices. With this, I try to evaluate the connections between the tribal traditions and the Hindu religious practices, focusing on the Jagannath cult and the Lakshmi Purana. Then number 4 would be iconography, Jagannath cult, and the tangible and the intangible cultural heritages thereof. And then my research addresses some questions like how do tribal narratives like the legend of Taratarini reflect the socio-religious structures of the Kondh tribe? Then in what ways does the Kui language facilitate the preservation of Kondh oral literatures? How do Santhal and Saura tribal songs contribute to environmental awareness and ethnomusicology through their narrative techniques? Then another question is, what role does Lakshmi Purana play in bridging tribal and mainstream Hindu traditions? And another question is, how can contemporary literary theories like New Historicism, Cultural Materialism, Structuralism, Post-Structuralism, and most recently digital humanities kind of platforms, how can they provide a framework for analyzing the thematic depth of Odisha's tribal literature? The Kondh tribes' respect, reverence for the goddess Taratarini is embedded in their folklore, serving as both spiritual guidance and cultural identity. During the Chaitra Parv, the epic narrative of Taratarini underscores divine protection and resilience. I would quote M.K. Patro, who says that the priest of the goddess originally belonged to the Kondh tribe, reflecting the deep tribal roots of Taratarini worship. It was published in the Odisha Review. One can get into the literary analysis of the legend using structuralism, particularly Lavishra's binary oppositions. The legend illustrates contrasts such as human versus divine and protection versus vulnerability. Victor Turner's concept of folk communitas, it applies here in a most subtle way as the festival and the epic performance reinforced collective identity within the Kondh community. Then I would go to Santhal folk tales. Then the Santhal communities, Bihon Bora tales, they narrate the origins of life and humanity's relationship with nature. Like I'm reminded about the studies related to Anthropocene and anthropomorphism these days. People are talking about studies of the human beings and also the animal studies. Performances during the Korma festival symbolize the life cycles and the fertility. Scholars argue that Santhal folk tales they have an ecological wisdom. They reflect a harmonious coexistence with nature. And then if you ask me to do the literary analysis using some literary theories, then I would say eco-criticism, it can highlight the environmental ethics inherent in the Santhal storytelling. And then we can also use archetypal criticism that identifies the universal motifs of creation and renewal, as observed by many texts from the Odia tribal literatures. Then let's go to the songs and ballads from the Saura tribes' rituals. Ethnomusicology is best practiced among the tribes. The winner writes history. Then what happens to the history of the so-called loser? Maybe the tribes and the folks, they sing their songs, and then that is preserved by the ethnomusicology. The Saura tribe uses ritual songs to mark life events, integrating spiritual and cultural narratives. These songs, directed at ancestral spirits, are laden with symbolic meanings. Saura ritual songs, they serve as a bridge between the living and the spiritual, maintaining a balance in their worldview. And then the literary analysis can happen through anthropological literary criticism and imagist theory. If you use these two, then probably you can make an interpretation of the Saura tribe's ritual songs and then make them a part of your ethnomusicological studies. Then Bonda tribes Lanja epic. The Lanja epic performed during the weddings, it is an ancestral practice. It has social relevance. The Bonda epics use repetitive phrases to ensure collective memory, aligning with oral formulaic traditions. And the oral formulaic theory, it reveals how Lanja utilizes stock phrases from memorization and oral performance that can take you to memory studies and memo culture. Memory studies is very important and it's coming up in a big way. A lot of researchers are working on the memo culture, which is memory culture. And then heroic criticism, it emphasizes the themes of bravery and loyalty, fundamental to the Bonda's cultural values. The Kui language is spoken primarily by the Kondh tribes. It belongs to the south central branch of the Dravidian language family alongside languages like Telugu and Tamil. Kui is particularly significant due to its role in preserving not just the tribal community's everyday communication, but also its rich oral literature, steeped in spiritual and ecological knowledge systems. The language structure is characterized by its phonological richness and syntactic patterns, distinct from the Indo-Aryan languages predominant in this region. One key feature of Kui language is its use of cohesion. And here affixes are added to root words to convey the complex meanings. And then this particular structural quality of Kui is ideal for encoding the levels of significance essential to indigenous oral epics and rituals, producing a mode that carries abstract meaning alongside the material reality. Besides the spoken word of Kui, which is indispensable to the tribal community, it also includes vital links with the language and culture. Kui functions as a medium for the tribe's cultural knowledge, transmitted through oral literature and shared during rituals and festivals across the generations. I am reminded about A.K. Ramanujan's The Interior Landscape, where he says, I would quote, "Language becomes how identity is forged, memories are preserved, and beliefs are passed on through generations." For the Kondh people, especially, Kui is far more than simply a method of communication. It is intertwined with their identity and social spiritual lives, and it serves as an archive of the tribe's history, cosmology, and worldview. The Kui language is integral to the oral literature of the Kondh tribes, and it is a spoken language and it exists without any script. That is how the oral tradition lives on in storytelling, songs, proverbs, and then they call it dakabachans. The proverbs are dakabachans. It helps the tribe storing their wisdom, cultural values, and belief systems. Oral traditions, they serve as mechanisms for the communal transmission of a cultural memory, and language itself acts as a storehouse of the communal identity. For the Kondh tribal groups, Narratives in Kui comprise their oral epics, which are fundamental to their collective memory and a reminder of their belonging as part of one cultural and spiritual community. The legend of Taratarini is an oral epic. It's a text, it's an oral epic which illustrates the role of Kui in the survival of tribal narratives, and from this, one gets to know about the Kond goddesses, the local deities who are addressed as Dharani Penu, who protect them from divine help. Recited during the Chaitra Parab festival, this narrative, besides religious importance, is crucial in maintaining the collective memory and bringing the communities together. Through language, the Kond tribal groups believe in touching the land and its people. In this sense, Kui language, an endangered language, is necessary for describing the tribe's relationship with nature through its rituals. Kond tribal folk songs frequently tell the stories of their relationships with the land and the deities. According to ethnomusicologist John Blackham, I am quoting, quote, ritual music in ritual cultures functions as an act of communion between the human and the divine, reinforcing cultural values and spiritual relationships. Stop quote. By upholding its nature through Kui, these chants render the ancient relationship of the Kond with nature in all its original contexts. The folklore of Kui is rich, portraying both the history and beliefs that people in this tribe brought with them through generations and manifestations of the social behavior. Consisting of folk tales recited in Kui, these oral narratives play a central role in the central life of the Kond people. Moreover, one of the most popular folklore, legend of Taratarini, says that goddesses protected a tribe called Kond from harm by killing the evil forces. The story is full of complications, very interesting story, and Kui embraces this ambit of narrative as widely possible in cases like this. One can, think about another important type of the tribe's oral literature as proverbs, and then the Kond tribal narratives have an environmental ethos. Another aspect of the cultural fabric and green studies of the Kond tribes is their oral literatures, and then the literature lives in through generations from grandparents to grandchildren, and it consists of stories about Konkani, which means today, about collectivism in them, and also the legendary tales. These epics and myths function as the moral guides for the people, how the tribe members should behave with fellow human beings and nature. And then there is this legend of Niyamgiri. This is a text. It reflects the relationship between the Kond people and their respect for Niyamgiri mountains, as well as for their deity, the mountain god, who is called the Niyam Raja. And this is one of the most important oral epics of the region. The sense of environment protection reflected in this myth depicts nature as a resource and a player and in the community's spiritual and social life, and then it is also an expression of the tribe's environmental ethics. An example of the environmental stewardship illustrates how the ideas are connected in a Kond oral epic, and in my case, the legend of Niyamgiri, Niyam Raja, about whom I studied as a mythological god of the mountains. He feeds the Kond people with all the crops this land produces. It is worked out in rituals and community gatherings. If you talk about food culture studies, food plays an important role in any community. So this legend of Niyamgiri, the Niyam Raja who feeds his people, this is his duty to feed everybody. So think about it. You can take it as a part of your food culture studies also. So it demonstrates the sacred connection of people to the mountain vis-a-vis food. In these stories, it is not that the gods they live outside of nature, rather they are the archetypal forces of nature that strive to balance out. And then next, the legend of, and then the themes of environmental stewardship, community resilience, and spiritual connection, about which I have been talking vis-a-vis the myth of Niyamgiri. This is something which is holistically presented through rituals, songs, and dance forms from the Kondh tribal communities. And the Kondh tribal groups, they have gender solidarity. There is maximum freedom for women to choose their partners, and then they have carnivals where a woman can go and choose her own partner. In addition, the belief of living in proximity to nature as an act of devotion and the emphasis on spirituality is also reflected in the ecological traditions of the Kondh tribes. The Kondh people's avoidance of hunting and gathering associated with the species from forest, who are the rare species from the forest, it demonstrates the respect for environmental protection. And also, seasonal migration is the strategy of survival for some Kondh communities even today. They migrate seasonally. Now let me contrast this with the mainstream environmental stories that we talk so much in our university tables. The Kondh tribal myths and oral traditions, they present a radically different genealogical narrative of the complex interdependent relationship between humans and nature than the mainstream narratives about ecology. Although much recent environmentalism focuses on sustainability as a scientific or practical phenomenon, the narratives of the Kondh, it frames some environmental care in decidedly spiritual and cultural terms. I will give you examples. Whereas most Western environmental movements have leveraged through policy and technology in the name of conservation and protection of the environment, the approach of the Kondh is rooted in spiritual belief. They want their human beings to be a part of that natural cycle. They don't try to fiddle with the natural cycle. Till date, that is. So we don't know about the future. And then nature, then the spiritual awareness, what I was talking about in the Kondh narratives is closer to eco-criticism, since it is a type of critical writing that deals with literature and nature. The Kondh myths demonstrate a deep understanding of the interrelatedness of entire life, which is again a part of eco-criticism and ecofeminism. This view is evident in many Western discourses on environmental issues, where cultural existence and nature are separate entities. But it is not so in the case of the Kondh tribal communities. This view is abounding in Jagannath culture as well. So this is the connection I find between the Kondh tribal practices and the Jagannath cult. In contrast, while Western environmental movements, they deal with ecology through biodiversity and climate change, the Kondhs, they conceptualize their relationship with nature as reciprocation and coexistence. This is something really interesting. Thus, the tribe's oral traditions offer an empowering example of environmental stewardship grounded in sustainability and a moral and spiritual obligation to the planet Earth. The literary and the ethnographic narratives of the Kondh tribe themselves, they contain an obscured lens into essentially wise methods of environmental stewardship. They are so wise, not like the so-called mainstream. And then they think about community resilience and spiritual connection to the world. An examination of the themes found in their oral epics reveals how these stories simultaneously reflect and influence the environmental awareness and practices of the Kondh people. Kondh narratives provide a deeper understanding of nature as a living spiritual phenomena, unlike the evolution of the quote-unquote mainstream forms of environmentalism. Even when facing numerous environmental challenges in modern times, the continued survival of these practices demonstrate why one must incorporate indigenous worldviews into modern environmental discussions. Now, after talking about the Kondh tribal groups and their indigenous knowledge systems, I will take you to the tribal roots of the Jagannath cult and the Lakshmi Purana, the historical and the cultural links between Jagannath cult and Odisha's tribes. The Jagannath cult, centered around Lord Jagannath of Puri, Odisha, is a remarkable example of syncretism between tribal and the mainstream Hindu traditions. Historical records and scholarly analysis reveal that Jagannath worship's origins are deeply rooted in Odisha's tribal religious practices. Lord Jagannath is called the tribal god. The story of the origin of Lord Jagannath, dating back to tribal king Vishwavasu, who is the rebirth of the Zarasavar, who was instrumental in bringing the life of Lord Krishna to an end in the previous birth. So Vishwavasu, the rebirth of Zarasavar, and his elite son-in-law Vidyapati. The Jagannath cult is an amalgamation of Vedic, Puranic, and tribal elements, reflecting the dynamic interplay between various religious traditions in Odisha. The iconography of Jagannath, Balabhadra, and Subhadra, devoid of human-like features, suggests an influence of the indigenous tribal art forms. Tribal deities such as the Kondhs Taratarini and the Sauras Thakurani share characteristics similar to those of the Jagannath Trinity, symbolizing fertility and protection. The dark skin of Lord Jagannath stands for solidarity with the dark-skinned colored people. The incomplete limbs of the Trinity gods indicate solidarity with the differently abled. This divine connection underscores the assimilation of tribal deities into the Jagannath culture. I would quote R.C. Majumdar here. He says, quote, "The wood-carved idols of Jagannath likely evolved from tribal wooden totems worshipped as manifestations of the divine." Stop quote. The annual Rath Yatra, which is the chariot festival, it's called the car festival. It further highlights the tribal connection. The cooks, the Daitapati, we call them Daitapati, the cooks of the Jagannath temple, are the progeny of the tribal groups coming from the lineage of the tribal king Vishwavasu. Scholars argue that the ritual of deities being pulled in chariots mirrors the ancient tribal practice of carrying idols through forests as a sign of respect and protection. It may also be interpreted as demythification of the divine by bringing the gods to the Bodadanda, the main roads of Puri, to meet the commoners, the marginalized, the subaltern. The Lakshmi Purana, another 15th century text by Balaram Das, holds a unique place in Odia literature and religious discourses for its progressive depiction of caste and gender equality. The narrative revolves around goddess Lakshmi, who visits the humble home of Dalit tribal woman Shreya Chandaluni after being insulted by Lord Jagannath's elder brother Balabhadra for associating with lower caste, quote unquote, lower caste individuals. The story foregrounds themes of inclusivity, flexibility, as goddess Lakshmi's act challenges the rigid caste hierarchies, dichotomies, and it highlights the spiritual purity of the marginalized communities. The Lakshmi Puran stands as a testimony to the egalitarian ethos inherent in Odisha's religious traditions, emphasizing that devotion and righteousness they transcend social and caste boundaries. The text is a powerful critique of orthodoxy, portraying the tribal woman as a vessel of divine grace and wisdom. Lakshmi's subsequent estrangement from the Puri temple and her ultimate reconciliation highlight a moral lesson on the universality of spiritual values. The text can be interpreted from gender discourses. The cultural synthesis evident in the Lakshmi Purana reflects a larger trend of incorporating tribal beliefs into mainstream religious practices. The narrative's emphasis on hospitality, humility, and reverence for nature aligns with the core values of Odisha's tribal communities, like the concept of Akshaya Patra in Odisha, where no one will come back hungry from an Odia household. So this concept of Akshaya Patra, where food never ends, food never finishes in that Akshaya Patra. This comes from the tribal connections of our Jagannath culture. This synthesis has contributed to the unique identity of Lord Jagannath's worship, positioning it as an inclusive and evolving religious tradition. Uh, then the rituals and iconography associated with Lord Jagannath offer profound insights into the tribal worldview, particularly their spiritual connection with nature and the cyclical time. Unlike the anthropomorphic representations common in mainstream Hinduism, the wooden idols of Jagannath, Balabhadra, and Subhadra are abstract and symbolic. This stylistic choice resonates with the tribal practice of worshipping natural objects such as the stones, trees, and wooden totems as divine embodiments. Victor Turner's concept of a communitas is vividly reflected in the rituals of the Jagannath culture, where all social hierarchies are temporarily dissolved during the festivals like Rath Yatra. The festival is an enactment of collective unity, a ritual space where devotees from all walks of life, irrespective of caste and social status and gender, participate equally. This mirrors the tribal ceremonies where communal participation is fundamental to spiritual expression. The Anuvashara ritual, which is where the deities are secluded and worshipped in a non-public space. This is called Anashara Ghar, okay? That echoes the tribal practice of cyclical rejuvenation. During this period, the deities undergo a ritualistic renewal, paralleling the tribal beliefs in the cyclical regeneration of life and nature. Furthermore, the Navakalevara, the new birth of the three deities, the ceremony of Navakalevara, where the wooden idols of Jagannath and his siblings are periodically replaced, symbolizes the continuity of life through death and rebirth, a theme central to many tribal cosmologies originating from the Kondh tribal practices of the Nilamadhava. If you remember the story of Vidyapati and Vishwavasu, this is a tribal practice in India, in Odisha. Nityananda Patnaik, again a critique, he states, I am quoting, the Jagannath cult is a living reflection of tribal philosophy where nature, community and spirituality coexist in harmonious balance. Stop quote. The blend of tribal and mainstream elements enriches religious practices in this cult. It challenges the rigid binaries between oral and written, tribal and classical, advocating for a more inclusive understanding of the Indian spirituality. Modernization and cultural homogenization, they pose significant threats to the survival of tribal literature, as traditional communities integrate into modern socio-economic frameworks. Their oral traditions often face neglect. However, globalization erodes these traditions by promoting a homogenized cultural narrative. In Odisha, the younger generation of tribal communities is increasingly detached from its ancestral languages and practices, drawn to urban lifestyles. This shift has led to a gradual decline of the oral recitation of the myths, folk tales, and ritual songs. This trend has also given birth to an alarming situation and the research thereof, language death. The Kui language of the Kondh tribe, for example, is endangered, with many younger speakers opting Oriya or Hindi or English as their primary languages. Moreover, cultural homogenization often marginalizes indigenous worldviews by prioritizing dominant narratives. Tribal literature, predominantly oral, has historically been sidelined in literary discourses and university syllabi. Mainstream criticism often views oral traditions as inferior to written literature, a perspective rooted in colonial and Eurocentric framework and worldview. Writing restructures consciousness and it privileges certain forms of knowledge over others. So this bias has led to excluding oral narratives from the literary canons. In Odisha, the rich oral epics of tribes like the Kondha and the Sora are rarely included in academic syllabi or literary anthologies. The legend of Taratarini, a seminal Kondha epic, remains largely unrecognized outside the tribal communities. This marginalization perpetuates a cultural hierarchy that devalues indigenous knowledge systems. The importance of preserving tribal literature identity, on the one hand, helps indigenous communities to preserve their culture, and it's also the other way around. This cultural preservation enriches the world's literary treasure through prized literatures from the margins. A study such as this has the capacity to demonstrate that these tribal narratives provide a different perspective on human relations with nature, community, and the divine. By doing this, we can reconstruct dominant literary paradigms and offer alternative perspectives on familiar narratives that serve as the basis for broad human experiences of creation, survival, and resilience. Tribal literature is a dynamic art form, constantly evolving and grounded in inherited wisdoms. By preserving it, one ensures that these rich cultural archives remain accessible to generations to come, creating a bridge of identity between the past and the present. Oral traditions are not relics of the past, but they are living expressions of human creativity. Despite the challenges, various government and non-government initiatives aim to preserve the tribal literatures today, which is a very promising fact. The Odisha State Tribal Museum in Bhubaneswar plays a crucial role in documenting and showcasing the tribal oral traditions, and many such efforts like the UNESCO also puts a lot of effort, and these things underscore the importance of collaborative strategies in preserving the tribal literature, where the Center for Adivasi Studies, which is holding this seminar international conference today, it plays a seminal role. Tribal literature offers fertile ground for applying contemporary literary theories. Structuralism, for instance, can be used to analyze the binary oppositions in tribal myths, such as human versus the divine or nature versus culture. Levi-Strauss argues, I will quote, mythical thought always works from the awareness of opposites towards the progressive mediation. Stop quote. Similarly, eco-criticism sheds light on the ecological consciousness inherent in the tribal narratives. The Santal folk tales, Bihonbora folk tales, which emphasize a harmony between human and nature, they align with eco-critical themes of sustainability and interconnectedness. The binary opposition between oral and written traditions has long dominated the literary discourses, often to the detriment of oral literatures. In Odisha, this binary can be deconstructed by recognizing oral literature's performative and collective features. The ritual songs of the Saura tribe, for example, serve as living texts that evolve with each performance, demonstrating a fluidity and adaptability often absent in the written texts. So that is where we can give credit, much more credit to the oral texts over the written texts. Then let me position Odisha's tribal literature in the broader Indian and world literary canons before I conclude. Odisha's tribal literature, when critically engaged, can enrich the broader Indian and world literary canons by incorporating tribal narratives into academic curricula and literary anthologies. Scholars can challenge the existing paradigms of the literary value. Like Homi K. Baba, he asserts, I will quote, the move away from singularities of class and gender as primary conceptual categories has rescued in an awareness of the subject positions of race, gender, generations, institutional location, geopolitical locale, sexual orientation that inhabit any claim to identity in the modern world. Stop quote. By situating tribal literature in these broader frameworks, we validate its literary merit, and foster a more inclusive and pluralistic understanding of literature. This research is a humble attempt at close reading of the tribal discourses from Odisha, and it has most conceivably underscored the immense cultural and literary value of tribal literature of the land. By analyzing the Kui language and the oral traditions of the tribes such as those practiced by the Kondh, Soura and Santhal, this research probes into the rich narrative frameworks, environmental knowledge systems and layers of spirituality inherent in these works. Select texts including the legend of Taratarini, the tribal hymns and praise of nature sung by the Soura tribes critically engage with indigenous knowledge encoded within the tribal literature through the principles of cultural hearing. The future research on this subject may probe into the difficulties with modernization and cultural homogenization that put these oral traditions at risk, while rethinking on region-specific tribal literatures being pushed to the periphery of conventional literary discourses. It demands a re-examination of its position in India and the New World literary histories. The polysemantic nature of tribal narratives through some contemporary literary theories like structuralism, new historicism, cultural materialism problematize a simplistic dichotomy between oral and written traditions. Before I stop, the future research and the possibilities are the things, the prospects are the things that I would like you to think about. It should be the food for thought for all of us today. Comparative studies, thematic cross pollination, digital humanities and digital documentation, research of political nature, these things should go into the study of the tribal literatures. That is how these kind of international conferences will be of some some help for all of us. Once again, I stop here, and I am extremely grateful to you for having given me an opportunity to talk about my research here vis-a-vis the tribal literatures of Odisha, their iconography, their textual history, and the cultural criticism thereof. Questions and suggestions are most welcome here. Thank you.